You're listening to the Accenture Insurance Influencers Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to the Accenture Insurance Influencers Podcast. I'm your host, Igrani Yu, and today I'm continuing my conversation with Matthew Smith.
My name is Matthew Smith, and I am the Director of Government Affairs and General Counsel for the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud.
In this episode, we'll be talking about how technology is changing the way that insurers fight fraud. Hello, Matthew, and thanks for speaking with me today.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me on your show and the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners for a few minutes.
I do want to talk about one of the other factors you'd mentioned in shifts in fraud, and that was technology and the ability of insurers to use it to better investigate and fight fraud. And I understand that you are a bit of a pioneer in that respect, notably using data from cell phone towers to gather evidence for insurance fraud cases, as well as using social media searches. So why are developments like this important for the fraud detection industry?
They're extremely important. And I think that we are really only at the tip of the iceberg right now in terms of where technology is going to lead us over the next decade or probably 2 decades. As I alluded to earlier, the technology we already have in place today would have been Star Wars technology even back in the 1980s and early 1990s. There's a program that I have the privilege of teaching, and it's called Where's Waldo and What's He Up To? And literally in that program, what we're able to show fraud investigators and people interested in insurance fraud is that we all leave a digital path behind us that allows an investigator to go in and know exactly where we were and what we were doing yesterday. So we can go back and we can build a model showing, using GPS, loyalty cards, when people stop at a bank and take money out of an ATM, when people go through a toll plaza and use a toll reader, or when people go into their business and scan in with an employee ID, that leaves a digital footprint. And we have the ability to use those digital footprints to go back and verify whether someone's timeline of where they claim they were, what they claim they were doing, matches up with what they are asserting and the evidence concerning the claim. Then you couple that with the ability to scrape data or pull data where we can determine who someone communicated with, where they made purchases, when those purchases were made, and the ability to put all of that together into a digital mosaic. It allows us to have much more ability to accurately determine where someone was, what they were involved in, and whether or not they may have been involved in committing the insurance fraud.
That's fascinating, and also from a personal perspective, slightly daunting to be living in a place where you do create that digital footprint just by your everyday moves. And then we're looking at something like the Internet of Things and connected cars and wearables. How do those play into the conversation?
You know, the Internet of Things is going to truly be fascinating as we see this unfold. But let me give you a real-life example already of where it is becoming reality. Today, we have already refrigerators, washers, dryers that have Internet connections. So imagine the ability when that device in your home is sending constantly data communicating with other devices on the Internet of Things, and you allege that you were not home yesterday between noon and 4 p.m. when the fire occurred. By pulling that data, we can find out that at 2:14 in the afternoon, you opened and closed the refrigerator door, or someone did. We can find out that at 3:15, a load of laundry was started. So all of these pieces that go into the Internet of Things, from Alexa to all of the smart home devices, all create, going back to what we were talking about, a digital trail. There have been several fascinating cases. One was a murder case down in Arkansas where literally they were subpoenaing the records of the Alexa device to see what Alexa may have heard leading up to the time of the murder. Now, that was a criminal case, not an insurance fraud case. But rest assured, those are the cutting edge cases that are going to take us into the future of what insurance fraud investigators will or will not be able to gain access to.
Wow. And where does consumer privacy fit into all of this?
One of the vital missions of the coalition is, if you go back to what I said at the start, we were formed 25 years ago by consumer advocates and insurers. We're in a brave new world as we look at the Internet of Things, as we look at all of the technology that we've talked about. But that has to be balanced with protecting consumers' rights of privacy and cybersecurity. Insurers have to at all times investigate insurance fraud, but do so within a very strong parameter of what the policy of insurance allows, what their state regulations and state laws permit them to do, and what are the ethical and moral boundaries as we as a society move into this new world of technology, the Internet of Things, and the ability to have much more in-depth investigation of our personal lives. So one of the true missions now of the coalition is to make sure that we and our members are at the forefront of not only recognizing and using these new technologies to fight fraud, but that we are equally the strong voice in leading the call to make sure it is done in best practices and make certain it is always done with the utmost of ethical and moral protection of the consumer. And we have to keep that at the forefront.
Definitely, and an excellent point. Now, I'm curious about the level of technology that we've talked about today. Is that typically used by insurers to detect fraud, or are they using more old school techniques?
I think we're in a period of transition, and I don't know that we can quantify and say it's 60-40, 70-30. One of the studies that the coalition does every few years is a technology study as well. And what we are seeing is that more insurers are using technology to identify fraud. They're starting to use artificial intelligence. They're using predictive modeling so that they can look at and analyze not only an insurance claim after it occurs, but also in the underwriting phase to try to prevent insurance fraud from ever occurring by using those new emerging technologies for better underwriting practices that do include anti-fraud components. So I think you are seeing insurers starting more and more to integrate these new technologies into their underwriting, their claims, and their fraud fighting platforms. But it's going to be a gradual transition going over at least the next decade ahead.
Right. And so a lot of what we've talked about, and I think what a lot of people think about when they think about insurance fraud is claims fraud. I'm lodging a faulty claim. And as you've mentioned or hinted at, there does seem to be a push for fraud detection to move earlier into the policy cycle at point of underwriting or even at point of quote.
Absolutely, at all phases. And that's one of the things we do advocate is that a true anti-fraud plan has to encompass all aspects of any insurance company. You have to look at your agent network. You have to look at internal fraud within the company. You have to look at underwriting fraud. Is that person who is securing that policy a real person? Or is it an avatar for someone else? Or is it a stolen identity of someone that is being utilized to purchase that policy? When we get into the claim phase, if it's a third-party claim, we need to analyze again, is that the real claimant that was involved in that accident or that incident? Are they fronting for someone else? Do we have reliable and accurate records, or have those been falsified? On first-party claims, the same factors apply. So it's all aspects of the insurance process that we look at and feel that insurance fraud needs to be integrated into.
And I think we're at a very curious junction right now where many insurers are making this shift to become more customer centric. So we've talked about the use of cell phones, and there's this push to almost take the insurer out of the process, or to make it as frictionless as possible, to make it as easy as possible for you to buy it, as easy as possible to file a claim, as fast as possible for all these things to happen. What does that mean for fraud detection if especially you're not dealing with a person in many cases?
It's very interesting because we're in an era right now where, as we've talked here on this podcast, we have better ability than we have had at any point in history to investigate insurance fraud. But on the other side of the equation, what you just said is exactly true. We're in a world of insurance right now that is becoming so consumer-centric, especially with the dramatic rise of millennials moving into the insurance marketplace and peer-to-peer insurance, where literally the entire insurance process from application to underwriting to claims payment is done on a smart device. We are moving so rapidly to processing claims. If you look at Lemonade, for example, Lemonade, the peer-to-peer insurance company, boast that they have paid a claim in 3 seconds. And that's all done with artificial intelligence. Now, they will claim they have algorithms built in and programs built in. But as other carriers move toward not using human interaction, using artificial intelligence, trying to cut down on the processing time of claims, we are going to have new opportunities for fraud. If you look now, most companies, there's an ad being run right now by a major insurance company, and it says, if you can do this, and it shows a person taking a selfie, then you can submit your insurance claim. So we're inviting people now to no longer have someone go out and inspect a vehicle after it's been involved in an accident, but just upload pictures of that vehicle. Well, do we know for a fact that that's the vehicle that was involved in the accident? Or even if it was, there are numerous websites that allow you to alter photos to make it appear as if a perfectly fine vehicle has been involved in a crash. So how we address those emerging trends of insurers wanting to be so fast in taking care of the consumer and balancing that with the ability that people have to commit high-tech fraud is going to be very much of a challenge for our industry in the emerging years.
That is definitely one of the big issues that I think arises from what is probably a need to update the insurance industry and its processes. So as insurers look to shore up their fraud detection toolkits, we've talked about so many different things that they have at their disposal today. What should they be focusing on in order to set themselves up for success, say, for the next 5 to 10 years? What needs to be in that toolkit?
The number one thing they need in their toolkit is to embrace the new technologies that are out there to protect not only the company, but more importantly, to protect the company's policyholders who put their trust in the company. But equally in that toolbox, you've got to put in there ethics, morals, best practices, written policies and procedures on how these new technologies are going to be used, who has access to this data, how will the data be utilized, and how do we share with the policyholders in fairness in their policy, how we're going to use this data, what data we are going to require them to present to us in the event that they make a claim, so that everything is disclosed upfront, very fairly, very honestly, and we know the parameters of how we're going to use these new technologies. So when we talk with our carrier members, we talk to insurers about embrace the new technologies that are there. Utilize them to protect your policyholders and your company, but make certain at the forefront of everything you do, you are leading with strong moral and ethical guidelines and communicating to your policyholders what you're doing and how you're going to be using this new data that we are emerging, gathering, and utilizing in fighting insurance fraud.
That's a great point. And the fact that you mentioned where insurers need to be more proactive in maybe defining what those guidelines are for themselves. I've really enjoyed our conversation today, Matthew. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you. It's been my privilege and my honor to be a part of the podcast.
That was my conversation with Matthew Smith from the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud. And we talked about how insurance fraud has changed as technology has changed. In 2 weeks, we'll be releasing our next episode. a conversation with Eric Jost from Willis Towers Watson. Eric will talk about how the role of the insurance broker has evolved and why customer centricity is so important to being competitive today. Until then, you can check out our older episodes or subscribe to get new episodes as they're released. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Accenture Insurance Influencers podcast with your host, Igrani Yu. If you like what you're hearing, visit accenture.com/insurancinfluencers, where you can hear even more in-depth conversation with some of the industry's leading thinkers.